Awesome. So for the database class, what we want to do is we want to dive in a little bit more on some detail of what you're going to need to build out as far as your database for viewing parties. So hopefully you had a chance to look over some of the user stories, prioritize them a little bit, and start to formulate some ideas around what kind of database you're going to need. And if not, now's the time. So you can, once we get the breakout rooms rebuilt, I think Tim was going to make them for us. Then we'll have you basically plan out, okay, well, we know we need user authentication. So what are we going to need for that? Maybe we'll refine that a little bit tomorrow based on a class with Alex. But for now, it's just kind of a rough sketch of like, what information do we need from the user for them to register? What information are we going to store from the movie database? How are we going to store, the notion of friends? How are we going to do the self-referential table? Is there other information that we could store or should store? Are there other gotchas around some of that? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time in this class talking about that. But before we do that, I do want to touch on one part that I didn't do, that I actually neglected to do, was talk about the eval for the viewing party project. So let me go find that browser window again. Back in mod 3. So I do want to make sure that we discuss the grading rubric for this. There we go. So I'm just going to share that screen real quick. And we'll just talk about the evaluation for this real quick. So like with most things at Turing, we're doing everything on a 4-point scale. And generally speaking, for most of the projects, there's like a few exceptions here and there. For most of the projects, to get a 3 on the project is like you passed, you did all the things that we asked you to do, that's a 3. In order to get a 4, you're like going above and beyond and learning something on your own that's kind of additional above like what we wanted you to build. In this case, we want you to build all the core requirements plus one of those explorations. That'll get you to the 3. For testing, we want you to get 90% or better test coverage, but we also want you to think about some sad path and what we call edge case testing, where what if a user tries to do something that just is kind of outside the lines a little bit? Like, what if they try to register with like a poop emoji or something like that? Like, how do we handle that? That would be considered like an edge case, where a sad path is like they try to register again with the same email address and we shouldn't allow them. So trying to register again with the same email address, that's what I would consider a sad path, versus an edge case, which is where they're trying to do something unexpected. When it comes to code quality, this is where you're going to use that Rubicop utility. Now, Rubicop can be a little bit too strict sometimes, so we are open to, getting some student feedback around, hey, Rubicop's complaining about this. I don't think we should do that. Like, we're open to feedback on those kinds of things. But generally, you'll be using Rubicop to kind of evaluate sort of the structure of some of your code. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the 4 pillars of object-oriented programming kind of as we go. And some of this will happen in the refactoring classes that we're going to get into next week. Most of the time in mod 3, though, we're going to be focusing on abstraction and encapsulation. I just wanted to make sure that I at least talked about the eval rubric a little bit. And so that eval is going to happen in week 2, and that's going to happen on the Thursday of week 2. While you're doing the eval, we will ask that when you're not in the eval, that you're watching a video on how to set up a Rails API, which has no front end, no HTML, no CSS, no JavaScript of any kind. We have a couple of pre-recorded videos, and those are listed in a separate calendar event. So when you're not in your eval, we do ask that you watch either or both of those. You'll get my perspective as well as Dion. We both have pre-recorded lessons on those. So that when we kick off that solo project that afternoon, you've already got some idea of like what you need to do to get started. So while you're not in the eval for this project, we'll ask that you watch those videos. All right, so that's pretty much it for that. So let's get back to viewing party. So what we're going to do to get started is we're going to put you back in your breakout rooms as a team. And this is just planning the database. So what information do you want to store for your users? What is your database table going to look like for like having this notion of friends or followers or people that you are following that you want to invite? What is a viewing party? going to look like as far as like setting up an actual viewing party. And I will tell you just straight off the bat, you will not be able to make a model called viewing party because the application is called viewing party. Rails will get confused if you try to make a model also called viewing party. The main application has a class built now called viewing party. If you try to make a model, it's going to conflict and you won't be able to run Rails S. You won't be able to do a whole bunch of other things because you're going to have a conflicting class name. So you're going to have to call the actual viewing party event something else. But you won't be able to call them viewing parties. Jake, you got a question about that?
Not about that specifically, but about database setup and structure and like data we're getting back in from the API. So one of the things we talked about last mod is that you don't want to be saving API data because obviously that data can be changed.
Right.
So if we're not saving that in our database, we haven't really dug into what we're getting back from the API yet. So what data are we getting back from the API that we want to be interacting with? Just title and like runtime and actors?
That's a good question. When you think of a movie, what would typically change about a movie over time? Maybe things that don't change are things we want to store in our database. But yeah, Jake hit on the most important part here. We don't want to store data that could get stale over time. So things like the movie rating, for example, that's going to be on that dashboard or on the results page, we don't want to store the rating because as soon as somebody adds a new rating on their other website for that API to function, that rating value changes and now it's no longer valid and we have what we call stale data now. And we don't want anything that's going to get stale. But things like the movie title, that's probably not going to change. The cast is probably not going to change once the movie's released unless an actor changes their name. So a good example would be like Ellen Page, who is now Elliot Page. They came out as trans male and they changed their name. And so in that case, yes, the cast could change their name. And so we don't want to store that kind of data. And so as a team, you're going to have to decide what should we store? What must we store? What would be nice to have, but what can we just go back to the API and get again later? And so what I want you to do in your breakout rooms is look through those wireframes and try to imagine what of this data do we have to have on our side versus what would be nice to have or what could we have?
Do we have to be worried about like esoteric movie things like a director's cut coming out or like we're looking
director's
at this movie
cut,
as like
yeah, director's cut would be a whole
movie.
It would be a whole other movie, right? So
Okay.
if you're thinking like the whole Zack Snyder thing with Justice League, right? That's a whole other movie. And so that would have a whole separate entry. Yeah. Yeah, great questions. So as a team, go back through those wireframes and go back through the user stories and try to imagine what would that database structure look like. Maybe start adding some database or add some user stories about setting up those models, setting up some of the validation testing that you're going to need for the different kinds of fields. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to go build your database today or even tomorrow. It could be kind of, a bit of like, well, we'll start with just the user because that's all we're building is the authentication thing. Once we get into the consuming the API, then we'll need those tables built. So maybe some of the database stuff isn't going to get built right away. And so you'll have a chance to play with the API, see what data does come back from the API. But we do outline a lot of it on those wireframes. So in your breakout rooms, what I want you to do is go through those wireframes and try to imagine, based on all this stuff, what could we have in the database, but what's the bare minimum that we must have? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a half an hour in your breakout rooms to talk about this. If you need a palm break in between, just advocate for yourself and say, hey, I need to step away for a minute, take care of you. We'll come back at 40 minutes after the hour and we'll kind of reconvene as a class and talk about just last considerations and maybe come up with a few ideas on like what are the core things that we must have or should have in our database, and we'll go from there. So we'll come back at the 40-minute mark. Sound good? Let's see. Tim, did you have a chance to make those breakout rooms?
I made them.
Oh,
I
you made them?
wasn't sure
Thanks, Alex.
Tim who was doing
Okay.
it. So here we go.
All right. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah.
All right, we're all back. Welcome back, everybody. Cool. So we got 10 rooms. I got a 10-sided nerd dice over here, so I'm going to roll for some rooms, and let's kind of hear perspectives. I'm curious what y'all have come up with as far as what you're going to store in your different tables. So we'll start with room number 4. That's going to be Alexa, Joseph, and Katie. What'd y'all come up with? Let's talk about like the user table to get started. What'd you come up with for your user table?
Do you want, well, okay. Do you want to share, Katie?
Sure, yeah. Give me
Okay.
1 second. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yep, it's coming through.
Cool. So on our users table, we have the primary key, the user ID, and then email and password so far. And we've kind of just been trying to figure out exactly like how friends, the relationship between friends and users, as well as our parties and movies. And did you want me to go in more depth about the parties and movies and friends as well, or just leave it at users?
Sure. While we're here, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we've kind of discussed a bit about like how parties would be our joint table between our users and movies. We believe that the friends will be a many-to-many relationship, and please, Joe and Alexa, jump in at any point if you have anything to add with that. But yeah, we're still trying to, for the most part, conceptualize like what the friends relationship will be with the users.
Yep, it's good. Awesome, thank you. Let's go to room 10. Let's go to Hope, Jenny, and Kwa. So about that friend table, what are some different considerations that we would have to make here? So if you can keep sharing your screen for a sec, but let's hear from Hope, Jenny, and Kwa. Like, what do you see about this? Like, how would you structure your friend table? What kind of considerations are we going to need there?
Yeah, we have something similar to Katie's diagram where we're referring to, you basically are referring to the user table twice, one for a user ID and one for the friend ID, but that is also a user. And then we also consider that you're going to need a status when you send them like a friend request. There has to be some type of status, whether they accepted, it's pending or not.
Okay, so just to go back to what we talked about with the project requirements, having like some kind of status field is like extension work. So you don't need to build that as what we would call an MVP. So we don't want it to get too advanced too soon. I would say start simple and add complexity as you need it. But yeah, that friend table is going to have 2 different user IDs, one for you and one for your friend, where you're going to be in there multiple times, once for each of your friends. So like it's going to be like my user ID and then Tim's user ID and then my user ID and Alex's user ID. But then Alex is also going to be in that first column with each of the friends that Alex wants to add and so on. So there's going to be a lot of rows in that table for all of the friends. But as I mentioned in the kickoff, just because I add Diana as a friend, because I want to invite Diana to a movie party, doesn't mean that Diana automatically gets to invite me. Diana would also have to add me as a friend, for example. Or, let's say Adam wants to invite Dominic or whatever. Like, it doesn't have to be a mutual connection of, yes, I accept. That could be something that you do as an extension later on. Cool. Okay. So just to refine that user or the friend table has to have 2 different user IDs, one for like who's starting the friendship, and then the other ID is like who their friend is. Cool. Hope, any other thoughts on that? I saw you unmute there.
Not at the moment.
No? Okay. Cool. Just checking. All right, let's go to room number 1. Room number 1 is Dominic, Doug, and Jeremiah. What did you have around like the viewing party itself? What kind of information are we going to need to track about like the actual viewing party movie event kind of thing? What are we going to have there?
So something that we talked about was whether you actually needed a database for the movie or not, because most of the information we need to get about the movie is going to be from the API, and we're going to have to hit that API anyway. We figured that we didn't need a movie table. So in that case, we're going to just store the movie title and possibly the movie duration on the viewing party itself. And then we're going to have a many-to-many table called Party Friends, which would allow us to invite as many friends to that party as we want. We were also discussing probably creating a host ID that would reference the user who created it directly instead of making them a party friend, so that you can treat them differently than the other users.
Yeah, because that's an important distinction too. Who's hosting the party and then who's attending the party or who's been invited to the party. So you don't have to build out like an RSVP, like, you know, Tim invited me to a moving party and I accept. Like, we're not asking you to build like a tracking thing like that. And so in the viewing party or event, or like call it events or something like that, in that table, having the host ID point back to the user ID as far as like who the host is, that would be a good idea. Having the movie title in there would be okay, but if it's a really long movie title and it turns out to be like a really popular movie, you're gonna have that string in there over and over and over and over and over and over. It might be a good idea to move that into a table and do what we call normalization, where you store that string one time in another table with a movie ID reference and then put that reference ID in that other table.
Okay.
What are some other pieces of information? Let's go to room number 5. Let's go to Andrew, Kyle, and Megan. What other information are we going to need to track about the actual viewing party event based on those wireframes?
I think we also had, like, I don't know if this was mentioned, like time, location, and duration.
The date and time, yes. We didn't specifically ask for location on there. But we will need a date and time of the event. Yep. By the way, is that a Logan movie poster in your background, Andrew?
Yes, it is.
I'm a huge Marvel nerd. Everybody's scoring brownie points today between chili and cheese and sunflower seeds. All right, room number 3, Jake, Jesus, and Jordan. Let's talk about other things. Like, what other things did you talk about in your team that you're going to track in a database? What are some other things that'll be helpful there?
We didn't get too much further than what everyone else has discussed. We spent a decent amount of time talking about the followers joins table,
Okay.
and how primary key is obviously just going to be a primary key, and then there's going to be like a user ID and then a following ID, where one user is then following the other one. And then talking about, we didn't actually start building it out yet, but that we're probably going to have another joins table after the parties that holds the guest list, which is what someone else was just talking about. Yeah, I don't know. Do you guys want to speak up? Is there anything else that we talked about?
We did mention a little bit of like what we're going to start in our movies table, which were the titles, the runtime, the genre, the summary, and the cast. And then the thing that we're not going to start in the movies table is going to be the reviews, because that it's going to be ever changing and it's going to be adding more every time.
Yep. And then once you start playing with the actual movie API, and so this would be something to do, is like go get that API key, get Postman installed, and like start actually hitting the API and see what data comes back. You may not even need to store that much of the data. For example, if you remember the reference to that movie, you might not need to store the cast. Because again, Tom Hanks has been in a bazillion movies. Do we want to store Tom Hanks over and over and over and over and over and over and over? Or how are you going to build out like 10 cast members? You're going to make 10 different columns in that table for each of the cast members. Like, tracking that kind of stuff could get a little bit complicated. And so things like fetching the cast for a movie, we could go back and get that later if we needed it. So again, just narrowing down, like, what do we absolutely have to have and what would be nice to store, but maybe we don't have to store all of that data.
And we started that conversation just by talking about the data types we would want. For instance, like genre, if there's multiple genres, we just store that as one big string. What do we do? Or do we go back and just grab it every time, that kind of thing?
And genres change over time too. You know, like today it might be like rom-com, but tomorrow they might actually spell it out like romantic comedy or something like that. And now it's like, well, now those don't match up anymore. Or if they're, you know, if they treat those as separate genres, you know, you can't really store an array in a database. I mean, there are ways around it, but not in a great way that you could make that then searchable later on. So again, those might be details that we could fetch from the API later on if we needed to. So one of the things that is not a requirement is when you land on your dashboard and you see all the viewing parties, either that you're hosting or that you're invited to, there was not a requirement to make those clickable to a show page. When you think about the overall workflow of like when you search for a movie and then you click on the title and you see all that information about the cast and the reviews and things like that in order to make a viewing party, there was no requirement from the dashboard page to get back to a similar show page like that. But what if we could? What would we have to store in order to get back to build that page? So let's say, you know, Adam invites me to a movie and I'm like, what's this movie even about? All I have is a movie title on my dashboard. What if I could click on that title and take me over to a show page where it shows me the cast and the synopsis of the movie and the movie reviews and things like that? It's not a requirement. We could do that as an extension story. But that could be an interesting sort of way to get back to that page and rebuild that page based on fetching data from the API as well. So as you play with that API, you'll start to see what kind of information comes back and what information we can kind of refine this database strategy a little bit to just store the bare minimum. But yeah, one of the things that a couple of teams brought up that was missing from Katie's diagram is who's invited to the viewing party. And so Katie's diagram had a good start of what are we going to store for the user, and just a username and a password, or I would rather use an email address as opposed to a username. Email address tends to be more unique. So email address and password, that may be all we need. Maybe their actual name, if you want to ask them for their real name, you could do that. From a friends table, those are just going to be references back to that user table. But then we need to know who's been invited to a viewing party event. And so that's also got to go back to that user table as well, so that we can figure out like who's been invited to a party. And so that'll be an extra table that you're going to have to design in as well. Let's open it up. Anybody else have other thoughts, other ideas on, you know, bare minimum or must have, maybe don't need, things like that? Genevieve, what do you got?
Yeah, I was curious for the, and I think you may have already touched on this earlier. I just want to confirm the assumption is that when a viewer gets invited to a viewing party, there is nothing currently in the core functionality that is required to determine whether or not a viewer has accepted that invitation.
Correct. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, you could do that as an extension. So like if I invite Genevieve to watch a movie, it's just an invitation, and there, you know, Genevieve is going to show up in a table for my movie event. Maybe later on in that join table of user to movie event, you could have like an RSVP, like Boolean of yes or no, whether or not they're going to be there. You could do something like that so that, you know, if I'm hosting a party and I invite all 29 of you, I know that only 15 of you are going to show up. So I don't buy like chips and nachos for like 30 people, except for those that love to snack out on chips and guac. Then we can all go a little, have a little party around chips and guac. Cool. Let's go to Ben. You had your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering when we actually get started, what data type to store the password as, because I know that usually it's a bad idea to store those as plain text. And at what point is the encryption algorithm going to intercept that incoming data and make it all nice and encrypted and pretty, and then kind of what the result of that encryption is to store it in the database? That's
a great question, and you're going to learn all about that at 9 a.m. Mountain Time tomorrow with Alex. Alex is going to walk you through like all the authentication stuff and like what's going to happen with those passwords. There is a bcrypt gem that you're going to use, and that's going to do the encryption for you. And it's a one-way encryption, so there's no way to decrypt it back into plain text because we don't want to ever be able to decrypt it. It makes us too much of a security target for that. Cool. Let's go to Kyle next, and then Jake.
Our group had a question around one of the requirements is that it lists, or sorry, each reviewer's author and information is listed as part of, I think, that film. And so we were sort of thinking like, do we need to create a separate user or a separate reviewer table that has all of their data?
No, we can just pull that as needed from the API.
Okay, all right, awesome. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Good question. And then Kyle. Oh, wait, you just asked the question, right?
Yeah,
So
I had my hand up. I
Oh,
had
yeah,
my hand up, but I think good.
Okay.
Well, let me ask for the class then anyways, in
Yeah.
case someone else has the same question. My thought process is that like, how do I even say this? There's a user table that has that info. There's going to be a joins table that is like the guest list for a particular party.
Mhm.
That guest list, we really want it to only have like the unique ID, the primary key, and then like the host ID. Oh, no, not even. Because then if it has the party ID, it can look back to the party to see who the host is.
Mhm.
And then we can always run validation at the time you're inviting a guest to make sure you can't invite yourself to the party.
That's a good point. Well, when you're building the party, you only want to show your friends. And so you might need a way to say from my dashboard where I type in my friend's email address and add them as a friend that I can't add myself as a friend.
Right.
Because then I wouldn't show up on that list of checkboxes when I'm actually creating a viewing party. So I would have no way to invite myself to the party because I can't make myself my friend.
Yeah, I need to dig through the stories a little bit more. I missed some of that. So you can only add, right, you can only add the people you are, not the term friend, but following
Right. Yeah.
to the party.
We're
And so
using friend as a pretty
Yeah.
loose term here. Yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
but I don't like half these people. So if you're not following, you have to be following someone to invite them to the party.
Yep.
Right. And so then that's the validation to make sure that you can't follow yourself.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah.
And Jeremiah is very hurt by your comment. Cool. Let's go to Alex S.
Okay, so it's sounding like, in terms of things that we're storing from the API, the bare minimum is getting to be like the movie title. I'm starting to understand that like we've got a viewing party for a movie. It sounds like we want to store the movies, I guess, that have been assigned to viewing parties, like that name, so that, and then like, I don't know what the API, like how you access specific information, if it accesses based on a movie title, or if the API has a kind of key or something that it gives us back from the movie. If it does have a key, we'll need to like store that as well, I guess.
Yep.
But is it, I mean, as I'm thinking and kind of, this is processing aloud to some degree. Is that sounding right? Is there other things we need to consider about what do we store from this API call? That's, I guess, the question is like,
Yeah. And Alex actually hit the nail on the head right there. In order to get a lot of this information from their API, we need to have a reference to that movie. And it's typically not going to be the title because the title of a movie is not necessarily unique. And so the movie database API is going to have a unique identifier for every movie. And we will need to store that in order to go refetch any of that data at another time. But because on our dashboard page, like if I'm invited to 100 movie parties, or I'm hosting 100 and I'm invited to 100, I don't want to have to make 200 API calls to go get the title in order to build that page. So it makes sense to store their ID value as well as the title of the movie in a movie table of some kind.
Yeah.
But those may be the only details we absolutely must store, because then based on that ID, we can go fetch any of that other data. We can go fetch the cast, we can go fetch the reviews, we can go fetch all that stuff. So as you play with the API, you'll see what comes back and what you have available to you. And as you read through the documentation of how you go access that data, you'll get a better idea of like how to refine this even more.
So that would like be leading to, there needs to be a routine whenever we're creating a viewing party that says, hey, do we have this title stored or this movie stored? And then like, if not, we're gonna need to go grab it. We need to go store it. We need to go reference this records. So like we have to have this kind of routine written that kind of handles like at the point of like creating a viewing party.
Yep, and Active Record already has something really handy built in for that. It's called find or create by, and you can give it like a key value. And so you can say, go find it. If it's there, great. If it's not, go ahead and create it and then give me back that object anyway. So yeah.
Wow, Active Record would have something like that.
Cool. Let's go over to Alexa for a question.
I'm just wondering, in mod 2, the projects kind of, it was more obvious how to split it up amongst partners. And I'm just wondering if you could give us some guidance on whether to split it up by models, by different functionalities, by show pages, just any sort of guidance would be great.
Nope. I know that's not the answer you want, but you're going to have to discuss as a team, like, what do you want to work on? Or, I mean, typically what we would do is once we prioritize those stories, we just take whatever that top story is. And that's the next thing that has to be built in order for things underneath it to come along next. Like I can't build the dashboard page without the database being done. And so those database stories have to be done first. And so as a team, you're going to have to organize who's going to work on which part. If you want to work on Active Record because that's an area where you're like, I need some growth in this area, or you know what, I'm actually like, I got a really good handle on Active Record, but not so much on styling. So I really want to work on the front end and how we make the page look. You can advocate for yourself as far as what you want to build. But aside from that, we're not going to give you very much guidance on who needs to work on what, other than we got a project to do. It's got to get done. So yeah, you'll have to work within your team, try to figure out, you know, if you've got 3 people on a team, how are we going to pair and have a solo? Do we all solo? Do we all kind of like swarm on something? You're going to have to work that out as a team. That's part of the process of this. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thanks for asking, Alexa. Let's go to Genevieve. I know we're like a little bit over on time, but I'm happy to answer questions if you got them.
So I know we have a class tomorrow for the authentication and authorization. As far as kind of kicking off and getting started on some of the project tonight, would it be better if we wait on creating some of that schema design, particularly for the user table, until that class? Or
yeah, you could start planning out like maybe some of the views a little bit, or at least start building out the shell of like what controllers might we need. Maybe start on some of the models, like, you know, now, okay, we're going to need a movie table, so we can at least start planning that out. You can always go back and add other migrations later for what fields you actually need to either add or remove fields later. So yeah, there's a little bit that you can get started on today. For sure, if you really want to work this evening. But yeah, a lot of it's going to kick off tomorrow.
Thank you.
Just saying hi to Remy over there. Cool. Any other questions? I know we're a little bit over on time. If you do have other questions, please drop them in the Code Help channel. We're happy to answer those for you. Aside from that, if there are no other questions, I think we'll let you go. I didn't see any come in over DM, so I think we're good. No other raised hands. Going once, going twice. Well, thanks for hanging out with us today. I think we're off to a good start. Y'all asked some really good questions. This is fantastic. We'll see y'all in the morning for authentication with Alex at 9 a.m. Mountain Time. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you.